Okay, so when we met on Monday, we were talking about the Nixon administration and the rise of Nixon to the presidency, but we were also at the same time talking about the disintegration of the relationship between the American people and the American government. But really at the heart and soul of it, it's the American people and the American presidency, and how this relationship is going through a very stressful and strained time. And what makes it worse and really brings it to its lowest point is Watergate. Um, when you go back to the lecture and when you go into the textbook, you'll get into the details of it, or you'll be reminded of the details of it. Um, and here in this slide, which is where we should have ended on Monday, you'll hear American reaction to the Nixon resignation. And on Monday, I talked about how Nixon, in his speech, when he talks about his decision to resign, he says that the reason why he decides to resign is not because he feels guilty about what he did. It's not because it's for the good of the country. He says it's because he knows he's lost support in Congress. And by that, he means he knows that Congress is going to vote and move forward with impeachment, and not just the House of Representatives. He also knows that the Senate will move forward and remove him from office. And that's saying something. That's showing you how stubborn Nixon is in believing that he was not obstructing justice and that he was doing the right thing. So on Canvas under modules, I'll post for you this video, and it's just a 4-minute conversation that these regular voters have. That talks about it. Some of them had voted for Nixon, volunteered for Nixon, even, and some of them believe that Nixon will come back. Some of them believe that history will judge Nixon fairly. Others do not, and so it's interesting to look back and see how people feel. But really, the question at this point for the Republican Party after August of 1974 is, okay, where do we go from here? What do we do now as a party? How do we decide who we're going to be? Because clearly we can't be the party of Richard Nixon, because Richard Nixon has left us in a disgrace. How does this move on? So what ends up happening is the Republican Party goes through a little bit of a change in its identity, and that's where we get into the heart and soul of this chapter. And that is where Foner calls it the turning tide of conservatism. And you'll notice that you have the rise of, and we talked about this in the lecture, the rise of this new base. The Republican Party is looking for this new base. And we talked about two fundamental groups of people, right? And this two groups of people will make up the base of the Republican Party. So I want you to ask yourselves who will make up these two groups. The first group being neoconservatives, and the second group being evangelical Christians, right? Evangelical Christians will be led by Jerry Falwell, who is, you know, a very conservative Christian pastor who establishes Liberty University, which still exists to this day. Liberty University is over in Virginia, and he is also responsible for creating magazines like this, the Moral Majority Report. And so the Moral Majority Report is this publication that helps to spread this message of um, of Christianity, but it's also a mix of Christianity and politics. So you'll notice you have this mix of a Christian message, but with a very political spin on it. So here is a headline about the Equal Rights Amendment. Here is another headline, but this time about AIDS and how AIDS is directly tied to being gay. And you'll notice on the very front page a very disturbing image of a family, a mom and a dad, and their two very little children. And you'll notice this very offensive and um, uh, very in your face headline where it says homosexual diseases, which, remember, this is the early 1980s, where people know very little about AIDS because AIDS had just emerged as this new disease. Uh, so, when we talk about AIDS, AIDS had been directly linked to gay men and no one else. And so immediately people come to the conclusion that only gay men would get this disease. And so, to take it a step further, conservative Christians believed that AIDS was God's punishment for being gay. And this sort of headline and this sort of image was. As shocking as it is, was typical. You'll notice that there are other headlines as well, right? Where you have politicians who are going after all of these different social type of issues. When we're talking about social issues, here's one about prayer amendments. Here's one about pornography. So this is not just about equal rights. It's about what they believe to be moral issues of the time. Here's another headline image. This one about, of course, abortion, which to this day, especially after this summer's decision from the Supreme Court, still is very much fresh on everyone's minds, right? The thing is that when we talk about the new ideas of the Republican Party feels very strongly in the late 1970s and early 1980s that appealing to a conservative Christian base is the new way of identifying with what they believe to be traditional values and traditional morals. And this will come from, and this will be inspired by these neoconservatives. Neoconservatives, remember, are these intellectual conservatives. These are people who tended to be educated at Harvard and other Ivy League type of schools, but they also tended to blame, the 1960s for derailing the American identity. The two groups combined were the reasons why the Republicans embraced this brand new conservative identity. So, of all the people that they go after to embody this conservative party, they decide that they're going to go after this guy from California named Ronald Reagan. Now, here's the thing. Ronald Reagan was a movie star. And when I say movie star, he wasn't like a shining beacon of a movie star. Ronald Reagan was a guy who was really well connected and at one point was the president of the Actors Union. So the picture on the left is an actual movie that Ronald Reagan starred in, and that was Bedtime for Bonzo. People don't believe me when I tell them, which is why I like to show them the actual poster. So Bedtime for Bonzo, that is real. That is a real movie. But he and his second wife, Nancy Reagan, they were both actors. And notice that I did say second wife. So Ronald Reagan is a divorced actor who was once the president of a union. He does not fit um, in any way, shape, or form the picture of what it means to be a Republican. But what ends up happening over the course of his career is that, as someone who embraced, becoming actively vocal in the public eye, he also embraced politics. So early on in his career, he was an active Democrat. He modeled himself after FDR. And then slowly but surely, he became more conservative, and then he became an active politician. And he eventually, in the late 1960s, became governor of California. Um, and that's not why the Republicans actively courted him. But here's the other thing, and this is incredibly important. Ronald Reagan was an actor. He knew how to communicate with the camera. And I want to show you how well he can communicate. So you'll notice, even in a very brief clip, how well he can connect with the camera, and the same thing with her, how easy they are in just looking at the camera, and how easy they are at home pointing to different things, even in just like 20 seconds, being able to smile and be at ease with each other and with you, the obvious guest in their home. Now, when we talk about uh, the actual ideas of conservatism, this is where things sort of go to hell in a handbasket for the Republican Party, because there's a big clash in the meaning of the word conservative. And this is where I want you to understand that not everybody agrees with this tradition of. Conservative, the old school conservative, with the new school idea of conservative. So let me see if I can do this here. So, what I want you to do is, I want you to watch this video of, or this clip of the clash between the old standard bearer, Barry Goldwater, who was the senator from Arizona, a one time presidential candidate who. Defined conservatism for many, many, many years, and how he takes on the new base of the Republican Party. And when he does, he basically says to them, "You don't know what conservatism means." It's important that you watch this clip. And I don't know if it translates entirely on the screen, but I'm going to play it anyway. And I'm hoping that you'll be able to hear it. But in playing it, what I hope that you hear and see is that Barry Goldwater basically says there's no room for social issues in a political ideology. But in order to understand that, you're going to have to watch this clip.
People say Goldwater lost in 1964. Some of us think Goldwater won. It just took 16 years to count the votes. In 1980, we finally got the results in, and conservatism had won.
Goldwater started the trend toward conservatism. Reagan picked up the ball and ran with it.
If Reagan was the savior of modern conservatism, Goldwater was clearly, John the Baptist to Reagan.
Ronald Reagan, who was a former grade B movie actor, made a speech for the Goldwater campaign for president in 1964. It ran on national television, and it was an overnight success.
Barry Goldwater has faith in us. He has faith that you and I.
And it was people who were brought up in the Goldwater movement who later were responsible for nominating and electing Ronald Reagan. Today's conservative ascendancy was built out of the ashes of Goldwater's loss. We didn't win a lot of elections back in the 50s, early 60s. But then in the mid-70s, conservatives figured out what we were missing, and that was the social issues, traditional values, and a lot of issues dealing with family, home, community, and we began to add that element to our political rhetoric.
And the perverts, and the liberals, and the leftists, and the communists coming out of the closet. It's time for God's people to come out of the closet, out of the churches, and change America. We must live.
Some of the conservatives from the 50s and the 60s were uncomfortable with bringing the social issues into the arena, and Goldwater was one of those people. He thought that they had no business being in areas like abortion and sex, just one thing after another. He just was appalled that this had become sort of the growing principal concern of the Republican Party.
Noting that he had promised to appoint the most qualified woman I can possibly find to the Supreme Court, Mr. Reagan this morning announced he had found such a woman.
I will send to the Senate the nomination of Judge Sandra Day O'Connor of Arizona Court of Appeals for confirmation as an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court.
The White House has received thousands of letters and telegrams opposing Judge O'Connor's nomination from right-to-life groups.
During my nomination, there was some criticism from one or two people who weren't too happy about it. Barry Goldwater had been a senator for some years. When my name surfaced, he immediately spoke out in support. Like most things with Barry Goldwater, it was a black or white proposition. He was for you or not.
What do you want to talk about? The Air Force? Or Chile? Oh, Sandra O'Connor.
Pro-choice would have been part of his kind of libertarian thing. It was kind of like, hey, you know what I mean? Man goes out in the West, you got your land, you farm it, you take care of yourself. Government shouldn't tell you what to do.
If it's going to take a fight, they're going to find old Goldie fighting like hell. I'm probably the most conservative member of Congress, and I don't like to get kicked around by people who call themselves conservative on a non-conservative matter. This is not a conservative issue. Abortion is not a conservative issue. It's a question of who's best for the court.
The Reverend Jerry Falwell says that good Christians should be opposed to Sandra O'Connor.
Well, you know what I said about good Christian.
No, what did you say?
How is that again, Senator?
Well, I don't think I can use it on the air, but ass.
I'll not be the judge of that.
Ass is in the dirt. I said all good Christians should kick him in the ass. When it comes to the place that these groups try to take away the power of the American citizen, then I have to take exception to it. That's not tasteful. I don't like to do it, but I will oppose this abuse of constitutional power any place that I have to.
When they finally voted on my nomination, and there were no negative votes, he came in and got me, and the two of us went out on the steps of the Capitol, and there were hundreds of cameras and news people, and there he was.
Did you feel about Jerry Falwell the same as you did one other time?
Oh, I might aim a little higher.
You mean kick him in the head?
No, not that high.
So clearly, we have a very different view of what it means to be conservative. But in the end, while Sandra Day O'Connor does get her nomination and her seat on the Supreme Court and becomes the first woman to serve as a justice, in the end, it also is one of the final sort of battles on the front of um, what it means to be a conservative that Barry Goldwater will win, because evangelicals are going to go forward and carry a tremendous amount of victory here. I mean, they are able to carry the day. I mean, what ends up happening is Ronald Reagan is going to continue to appeal to this particular base, because those are the people who are going to vote and vote and vote in his favor and for these kinds of Republicans. And Republicans will continue to vote for issues that reflect, uh, you know, their kinds of values. And this is going to translate in his foreign policy as well. I want you to listen to the kind of language that Reagan uses when it comes to um, his fight against communism. Because, yes, this fight is continuing even into the 1980s. And remember what I told you, this is an ongoing fight. But listen to what he says and compare it to what we have heard from the likes of John F. Kennedy and even Richard Nixon himself. And tell me, or think to yourself, how different this is.
Association of Evangelicals community from coast to coast in our great land deeply appreciates and values his love for the truth of the Bible and his commitment to its great moral values. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan.
A number of years ago, I heard a young father, a very prominent young man in the entertainment world, addressing a tremendous gathering in California. It was during the time of the Cold War, and communism and our own way of life were very much in people's minds, and he was speaking to that subject. And suddenly, though, I heard him saying, "I love my little girls more than anything," and I said to myself, "Oh no, don't say that." But I had underestimated him. He went on, "I would rather see my little girls die now, still believing in God, than have them grow up under communism and one day die no longer believing in God." There were thousands of young people in that audience. They came to their feet with shouts of joy. They had instantly recognized the profound truth in what he had said with regard to the physical and the soul and what was truly important. Yes, let us pray for the salvation of all of those who live in that totalitarian darkness. Pray they will discover the joy of knowing God. But until they do, let us be aware that while they preach the supremacy of the state, declare its omnipotence over individual man, and predict its eventual domination of all peoples on the earth, they are the focus of evil in the modern world. It was C.S. Lewis who, in his unforgettable Screwtape letters, wrote, "The greatest evil is not done now in those sordid dens of crime that Dickens loved to paint. It is not even done in concentration camps and labor camps. In those we see its final result. But it is conceived and ordered moved, seconded, carried, and minuted in clear, carpeted, warmed, and well-lighted offices by quiet men with white collars and cut fingernails and smooth-shaven cheeks who do not need to raise their voice. But because these quiet men do not raise their voices, because they sometimes speak in soothing tones of brotherhood and peace, because like other dictators before them, they're always making their final territorial demand, some would have us accept them at their word and accommodate ourselves to their aggressive impulses. But if history teaches anything, it teaches that simple-minded appeasement or wishful thinking about our adversaries is folly. It means the betrayal of our past, the squandering of our freedom. So I urge you to speak out against those who would place the United States in a position of military and moral inferiority. You know, I've always believed that old Screwtape reserved his best efforts for those of you in the church. So in your discussions of the nuclear freeze proposals, I urge you to beware the temptation of pride, the temptation of blithely declaring yourselves above it all and label both sides equally at fault, to ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding, and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil.
So I want you to think about the words that he used, the terminology that he used, and compare that to what we have heard before. When Kennedy spoke in June of 63, and he was talking about the evils of nuclear war and the threat of a nuclear war, and how tired Americans were of war itself, how tired Americans were of fighting, and had no desire to pursue war. Then he talked about how Americans had no desire to want to pursue fighting in that sense. And then he presented Russians as people who wanted to raise their children, people who were people of culture and long history, who had contributed to humankind in positive ways. And then you can skip on to Nixon, who went to China and then later on to Russia, but in China gave a speech that said, "We are not people who are seeking to take over each other's territories or conquer each other. We are seeking to coexist. We are seeking to figure out what we can learn from each other." And then you compare that to what Reagan just said in this speech. And Reagan is talking about a people who are basically, as he described, the focus of evil. Let me see if I can find my notes on this. He says, the focus of evil on the modern earth. And yes, he did say, yes, let us pray for their salvation. But he does it in a way that suggests that there is no hope for them other than God, because we will not be a hope for them. We will not be the people who work with them. We will not coexist with them. So this is not someone who is looking for a partnership in any way, looking to compromise with them in any way. There is no negotiating that is happening here. And one thing that is of note that I want to make sure you understand. This is a speech that he is not making at a campaign rally. He's not giving this speech to Congress. This speech is being delivered to the National Association of Evangelicals. So it's not to politicians, it's not to political experts of any kind. It is the National Association of Evangelicals. So these are specifically to Christians who have actively become involved and invested in politics, right? So he is now specifically invoking Christianity in the war on communism and basically saying this is about getting involved in all things God related. And this is where this is what we have to do now. Reagan gets of course, so invested in this that he believes that we have to involve space, and believes that we can now use space to our advantage, and create a space level protection program. Critics mock it and call it Star Wars. And the only way that this is able to calm down in any way is not because of Reagan, it's because of his Russian counterpart, Mikhail Gorbachev. On the other side, so on the right hand side, you see the cover of Time magazine, that says "Let's Talk." And Mikhail Gorbachev, who actually just passed away only a few months ago, Mikhail Gorbachev was at the time considered a progressive communist, if you can have one of those, a progressive communist. And the reason why was because his back was against the wall. The thing is that Russia had just lost a war to Afghanistan. They were fighting for control over Afghanistan, and they had lost. And that was because the United States was providing missiles and other weaponry and millions of dollars to Osama bin Laden. Yes, the very same Osama bin Laden. And so they had lost that war technologically, economically, militarily. The Russians were falling behind. And Reagan announces his big space program that was never going to happen. And Mikhail Gorbachev was like, okay, this is not going to work. This is just never going to happen. And what I want you to understand is that when we talk about progress towards some level of coexistence, it has to happen, and it has to be initiated from the other side, because it wasn't going to happen from Reagan, and it certainly wasn't going to happen from the new evangelical base or from the neoconservatives. And that's where we leave this new Republican Party. And when we talk about how this all comes to an end, which is what's going to happen in this new chapter that you read for next week, what I want you to understand is the guy who replaces Ronald Reagan, which will be George H.W. Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush. What you get is someone who is underestimated, undervalued, and completely overlooked. But in the decades that have passed since his presidency, what we have realized is he is much more significant and much more important than he's given credit for. And that's what I want you to pay attention to.